The loudest victory I ever witnessed ended in complete silence. That was the first thought that crossed my mind as I watched more than 100 SUVs, pickup trucks, delivery vans, and school buses stack up behind a locked steel gate under the cold Montana sunrise. Engines idled. Brake lights glowed like a string of red Christmas bulbs stretching farther than I could see. The smell of diesel drifted across the morning air, while impatient horns echoed through the valley. 3 days earlier, those same people had been cheering outside the county courthouse because they believed their HOA had finally beaten me. 3 days earlier, they celebrated the lawsuit that was supposed to take away 1,600 acres my family had owned long before their subdivision even existed. They thought the judge's ruling meant they had won everything. They couldn't have been more wrong. My name is Nathan Whitaker. I'm 41 years old, and I own 1,600 acres of ranch land tucked against the foothills outside Bozeman, Montana. My grandfather bought the first parcel with money he earned repairing tractors after returning home from Korea. My father expanded it one pasture at a time until the property became one continuous stretch of rolling grass, pine ridges, spring-fed creeks, and grazing fields. Every fence post has a story. Every weathered barn carries fingerprints from 3 generations of Whitakers who believed that land wasn't something you borrowed from the bank. It was something you protected for the next generation. Growing up, I learned the ranch the way other kids learn video games. I knew where the elk crossed in late October. I knew which creek stayed cold enough for trout through the hottest July afternoons. I even knew exactly how every gravel road sounded beneath a truck depending on the weather. Dry gravel crackled. Fresh rain softened every tire. Winter packed it into frozen stone. But there was one road my grandfather treated differently from every other trail on the ranch. It was a narrow private road cutting across the southern edge of our property before reaching the highway. He would stop his old Ford pickup there every single time we passed. He'd tap the steering wheel twice, stare down the road, and repeat the same sentence so many times I can still hear it as clearly as the wind moving through the cottonwoods. Never sell the road, Nate. I used to laugh because the road looked ordinary. Just gravel, steel fencing, cattle guards, and a weathered entrance gate that squealed every time it opened. I thought he was being sentimental. Years later, I realized he wasn't protecting a road. He was protecting the only key that unlocked an entire valley. Unfortunately, someone else eventually decided that key belonged to them. Nobody outside our family ever understood why that narrow gravel road mattered so much, because all they ever saw was a dusty entrance disappearing between 2 weathered fence lines. They did not see the decades of history buried beneath every inch of packed stone. They did not know that my grandfather had paid for every load of gravel himself, or that my father spent nearly every spring repairing washouts after snowmelt flooded the low spots. I still remember riding beside Dad in his old pickup before sunrise, the smell of fresh coffee mixing with damp earth while meadowlarks sang across the pasture. We would stop to clear fallen branches after storms because he believed that taking care of the smallest details kept the entire ranch alive. That road connected every important chapter of our family's life. It carried calves to market every fall. It brought veterinarians during difficult winters. It welcomed neighbors for branding season and carried friends home after Thanksgiving dinners that stretched late into the evening. It was never just an access road. It was part of the ranch itself. About 8 years ago, everything around us started changing. Ranches that had been quiet for generations disappeared behind construction fencing. Hay fields turned into streets with decorative streetlights. Cottonwood groves became rows of nearly identical houses with fresh sod that somehow always looked too green to be real. Developers called it progress. Around here, most of us simply called it expensive. Then Eagle Ridge Estates appeared on the neighboring property almost overnight. Bulldozers replaced cattle. Concrete replaced creek beds. The sound of hammers echoed where coyotes used to call after sunset. Within 2 years, more than 300 homes stood where open prairie had once stretched to the horizon. At first, I honestly believed we could all be good neighbors. Families waved when they drove by. Kids pointed excitedly at horses grazing behind my fences. I even allowed local school groups to visit every spring so children could learn where beef actually came from instead of believing it magically appeared wrapped in plastic at the grocery store. Everything felt respectful until Linda Ashcroft became president of the Homeowners Association. Linda always arrived looking perfectly organized, driving a spotless white luxury sport utility vehicle that somehow never collected a speck of Montana dust. Her smile looked friendly enough, but it never quite reached her eyes. The first time she visited, she complimented the ranch for nearly 10 minutes before casually asking whether I had ever considered selling the southern road. She described it as a wonderful opportunity for community connectivity. She explained that a second entrance would improve emergency response, property values, and traffic flow for Eagle Ridge Estates. I thanked her for stopping by and politely declined. She smiled even wider, shook my hand, and told me she completely respected my decision. A month later, another offer arrived by certified mail. Then another. Every proposal came with larger numbers and longer explanations about why selling that road would benefit everyone involved. Each time my answer stayed exactly the same. No. Eventually the offers stopped, but something else quietly took their place. Survey crews began appearing near my fences. Expensive drones hovered above the property line. Real estate brochures suddenly showed maps with roads that did not actually exist. Standing on my porch one cool September evening, listening to the wind ripple through the grass, I had the uneasy feeling that Linda had stopped trying to buy the road because she had already started planning another way to get it. The first sign that something had changed was not another offer in the mail. It was the traffic. Cars that had never belonged on ranch roads suddenly appeared every afternoon, cutting across the southern entrance as though it had always been public. Families drove slowly, pointing at the hills while children pressed their faces against the windows. Delivery vans used my gravel road to save a few minutes instead of driving around to the subdivision's official entrance. At first, I assumed their navigation apps were wrong, so I stopped every driver with a smile and politely explained that they were on private property. Most apologized immediately and turned around. But the pattern continued. Every week brought more unfamiliar vehicles, more tire tracks, and more assumptions that my family's road existed for everyone else's convenience. Then one Saturday morning, I walked outside carrying a cup of coffee and noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Fresh wooden stakes had been hammered into the shoulder of my road. Bright orange survey ribbon fluttered in the breeze, snapping softly against the fence wire. The smell of freshly cut pine mixed with damp grass as I pulled one of the stakes from the ground. A tiny label identified a surveying company hired by Eagle Ridge Estates. Nobody had asked permission. Nobody had even called. I contacted the company that afternoon. The survey manager sounded genuinely surprised when I explained where his crew had been working. He promised to investigate, and by the following morning the stakes disappeared. I figured that would be the end of it. Instead, Linda showed up at my gate 2 days later wearing another perfectly pressed blazer that somehow looked untouched by the Montana wind. She smiled the same practiced smile I had seen every time she wanted something. She explained that the survey had simply been a misunderstanding during a long-term community planning project. Then she casually added that the homeowners association believed the road had gradually become a shared access corridor through years of neighborhood use. I remember looking at her for several seconds before answering because I honestly thought she was joking. Shared according to whom? I asked. She folded her hands and calmly replied that repeated public use often created expectations, and expectations sometimes became legal rights. Her voice stayed soft, almost comforting, but every word landed heavier than the last. I told her the road had always remained private, that every deed for our ranch reflected exactly that, and that allowing the occasional lost driver to turn around did not magically transfer ownership. She thanked me for my opinion as though we had just finished discussing the weather instead of my family's property. Before leaving, she glanced back at the gate and quietly said, "Sometimes the law sees things differently than landowners do." The sound of her vehicle faded down the county road, but those words stayed with me all evening. Over the next month, the pressure slowly increased. Neighbors I had never met suddenly stopped by to suggest that sharing one little road would make everyone happier. Local real estate advertisements described Eagle Ridge Estates as offering convenient multiple access points even though only one legal entrance actually existed. During a county planning meeting I attended about water permits, I overheard two developers confidently discussing future improvements to what they called the Southern Community Entrance. I realized then that Linda was no longer trying to negotiate. She was building a story, one conversation at a time, until enough people believed it that the truth itself would become inconvenient. The certified envelope arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, tucked between feed catalogs and utility bills inside my old metal mailbox. Even before I opened it, I could feel the heavier paper inside, the kind lawyers seem to favor because it somehow makes bad news feel more official. The sharp smell of fresh printer ink drifted out as I unfolded the first page, and right there across the top were the words that changed everything. Eagle Ridge Estates Homeowners Association versus Nathan Whitaker. They were asking the court to recognize my family's private road as a permanent community access easement. According to their complaint, years of uninterrupted public travel had transformed the road into an essential route serving hundreds of homeowners. They argued that denying access would create unnecessary hardship and damage surrounding property values. I read every page twice, standing beside the mailbox while a cold breeze rolled across the pasture. Not once did the filing mention my grandfather. Not once did it acknowledge the recorded deeds that had governed this land for decades. Instead, it painted me as a stubborn rancher refusing to cooperate with reasonable neighbors. Within days, the story spread faster than spring wildfire. Local newspapers described the case as a battle between private land rights and growing community needs. Television crews parked outside the courthouse interviewing residents who insisted they had always believed the road belonged to everyone. Social media filled with aerial photographs showing my ranch surrounded by neighborhoods, accompanied by comments claiming one landowner should not be allowed to inconvenience hundreds of families. Complete strangers who had never stepped onto my property suddenly became experts on what I should do with it. At the feed store, conversation stopped when I walked through the door. Some longtime neighbors quietly wished me luck. Others suggested that maybe sharing one road was simply the price of living near a growing town. Even businesses began feeling the pressure. A local contractor canceled a fencing project after explaining that several Eagle Ridge homeowners were important clients. Nobody threatened him directly. He simply decided it was safer not to become involved. Meanwhile, Linda appeared everywhere. She attended county meetings, gave interviews, and spoke with the calm confidence of someone convinced history was already on her side. She never raised her voice. She never insulted me personally. Instead, she repeated the same carefully crafted message. This was about fairness, public safety, and responsible growth. Every interview made her sound more reasonable while making me appear increasingly isolated. Then came the mediation session. We met inside a conference room overlooking the courthouse parking lot. The air smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Linda slid one final proposal across the table. If I voluntarily granted permanent access, the Homeowners Association would withdraw the lawsuit and publicly thank me for supporting the community. I looked down at the document without touching it. Hidden beneath the polished language was exactly what my grandfather had warned me about decades earlier. Once the road stopped being ours, it would never belong to the Whitaker family again. I pushed the agreement back across the table and quietly said no. Linda nodded without showing the slightest disappointment. She gathered her papers, smiled politely, and replied that the court would decide what was best. As she walked out of the room, I watched the courthouse doors close behind her and realized she had never truly expected me to sign anything. From the very beginning, her plan had always depended on 12 words written into a lawsuit instead of one signature written on a contract. By the time the case finally reached the courthouse, it no longer felt like a disagreement over one gravel road. It felt like the entire county had chosen a side before a single witness had spoken. Every morning I drove into town before sunrise, the headlights of my pickup cutting through thin layers of fog hanging over the fields. The courthouse parking lot filled early with television vans, reporters carrying cameras, and residents from Eagle Ridge Estates who greeted one another like they were attending a championship game instead of a legal hearing. The heavy wooden courtroom doors opened with a deep creak, and the quiet conversations inside stopped for a moment whenever I walked in. I kept my eyes forward, nodded politely to the people I recognized, and took my seat beside my attorney. He had handled property disputes for nearly 30 years, and even he admitted this case had become unusually emotional. During one recess, he leaned closer and spoke softly enough that only I could hear. He said the law was still on our side, but public opinion had become its own kind of pressure. Judges ignored headlines, he reminded me, yet every complicated case carried uncertainty. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else he said. Eagle Ridge presented polished exhibits, colorful maps, traffic studies, and expert witnesses who explained how much safer life would supposedly become if permanent access crossed my ranch. They described the road as though it had naturally evolved into shared community infrastructure. Listening to them, anyone unfamiliar with the history would have believed my family had simply wandered onto someone else's property by accident. Linda remained calm through every session. She smiled respectfully at the judge, thanked each witness, and never once appeared impatient. From the outside, she looked completely reasonable, which somehow made the situation even more frustrating. Outside the courthouse, interviews continued every afternoon. Reporters asked homeowners how they felt about the possibility of losing easier access. Nobody asked what generations of recorded property rights were worth. Nobody wanted to hear stories about my grandfather repairing flood damage with his own hands or my father replacing cattle guards after every hard winter. Heritage was difficult to fit into a 30-second news segment. One evening I returned to the ranch exhausted and found an old family photograph sitting on the kitchen table. My mother had stopped by while I was gone. The picture showed my grandfather standing beside the original entrance gate sometime in the late 1960s, wearing worn work boots and smiling into the sun. I stared at that photograph while rain tapped softly against the windows. Then I noticed something I had somehow overlooked for years. Hanging from the gate behind him was a small weathered metal sign that read "Private Road, Authorized Access Only." The same sign had disappeared decades earlier when the old gate was replaced. I smiled for the first time in weeks, not because the photograph would magically win the lawsuit, but because it reminded me that my grandfather had never left anything to chance. If he had taken the time to post that sign back then, there was a good possibility he had protected the road in other ways as well. The next morning, before driving back to court, I unlocked the dusty storage room inside the oldest barn on the ranch, convinced that somewhere beneath generations of carefully labeled boxes, my grandfather might still have one more lesson waiting for me. The storage room smelled exactly the way I remembered from childhood, a mixture of aged pine, machine oil, old paper, and the faint scent of leather that never seemed to disappear no matter how many years passed. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon sunlight slipping between the weathered barn boards. Shelves lined every wall, filled with neatly labeled boxes because my grandfather believed that if something mattered once, it would probably matter again someday. I started opening one box after another. Tax records, livestock receipts, equipment manuals, yellowed family photographs. Hour after hour passed while the courthouse battle continued without me for the afternoon. I was beginning to wonder if I had built false hope around one old photograph when I noticed a narrow steel filing cabinet tucked behind an antique workbench. The bottom drawer resisted before finally sliding open with a long metallic scrape. Inside sat a single dark green folder, noticeably cleaner than everything around it. Across the front, written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words: Southern Access Corridor. My heartbeat quickened as I carried the folder into the sunlight. Inside were original survey maps dating back to 1968, professionally drafted property diagrams, notarized agreements, correspondence with the county recorder, and copies of recorded filings bearing official seals that were still perfectly legible. Every document had been organized in chronological order. My grandfather had anticipated future questions decades before anyone in Eagle Ridge Estates had even imagined building homes beside our ranch. Then I reached the final section of the folder. Folded inside a protective sleeve was a recorded declaration attached to the property's deed. My attorney arrived less than an hour later after I called and asked him to come immediately. We spread every page across the old wooden workbench while swallows circled outside the open barn door. He read silently for several minutes before removing his glasses and looking at me with an expression I had not seen once since the lawsuit began. It was the first genuine smile. The declaration confirmed that the Southern Road remained a perpetual private access corridor reserved exclusively for the Whitaker property unless the owner voluntarily granted temporary written permission. More importantly, an additional clause stated that any permissive use could be revoked at the owner's discretion and that no continued use, no matter how long it lasted, could establish a permanent claim against the recorded property rights. Everything had been properly recorded with the county decades earlier. Every page carried filing numbers matching the public record. Nothing about it was hidden. It had simply been forgotten because nobody had needed to look at those documents for nearly 40 years. My attorney carefully returned every paper to the folder and told me something I will never forget. He said the strongest evidence in a courtroom is often not the newest document, but the oldest one that everyone else overlooked. We drove directly to the county recorder's office before closing time to obtain certified copies, confirming that every filing remained active exactly as my grandfather had intended. As we walked back to the truck beneath a cool evening sky, I realized something else. Linda had spent years building her entire legal strategy around assumptions, public opinion, and convenience. My grandfather had built his around recorded facts. Those two things can look surprisingly similar until the day someone places both of them on the same table in front of a judge. When court resumed the following morning, I carried the certified copies inside a plain leather folder that looked no different from the dozens of files every attorney brought into the building each day. There was no dramatic announcement, no surprise witness waiting in the hallway, and no last-minute speech rehearsed in front of a mirror. My attorney had already warned me that winning property cases was rarely about emotion. It was about patience, documentation, and timing. We agreed that every document would be introduced exactly when the court reached the question of whether years of occasional travel across my road had somehow created a permanent legal right. Until then, we would simply let Eagle Ridge Estates present every argument they had prepared. I sat quietly through hours of testimony while survey maps flashed across courtroom screens and consultants discussed projected traffic patterns with impressive confidence. Charts estimated future growth. Engineers described hypothetical emergency routes. One witness even explained that many residents genuinely believed the southern road belonged to the community because they had used it for years without objection. I did not interrupt. My attorney did not object unless absolutely necessary. The more they spoke, the more obvious it became that their entire case rested on one assumption. They believed repeated convenience had quietly replaced recorded ownership. During a short recess, I stepped outside onto the courthouse steps. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of dry leaves and freshly brewed coffee from a cafe across the street. Reporters clustered near the sidewalk, hoping someone would provide another dramatic quote. Linda stood several yards away speaking calmly with a television crew. She looked completely confident. People around her smiled, nodded, and acted as though the outcome had already been decided. She caught my eye for just a moment and offered a polite smile that seemed almost sympathetic. I simply nodded back and walked inside without saying a word. There was nothing left to argue in the parking lot. The only conversation that mattered would happen inside the courtroom. When proceedings resumed, the judge asked both sides to address the legal history of the access road itself. My attorney slowly stood, thanked the court, and placed our folder on the counsel table. One by one, he introduced the original survey maps, the recorded declarations, the county certifications, and finally the decades-old provision stating that temporary permissive travel could never mature into a permanent right against the owner's recorded title. Every exhibit matched official county records exactly. There were no missing signatures, no disputed dates, and no unclear language. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter with each page. Even the sound of papers turning seemed louder than before. Linda's attorney requested several moments to review the newly certified documents. He flipped through every page carefully, comparing recording numbers with his own files. His confident expression slowly disappeared, replaced by the focused silence of someone realizing an important piece of the story had existed all along, hidden in plain sight. I glanced toward the gallery where several Eagle Ridge residents sat watching. They looked confused rather than angry, as though they had just discovered that everything they had been told about the road was only part of a much older history. For the first time since this lawsuit began, I stopped worrying about what people believed. The facts no longer needed anyone's opinion. They only needed to be read. The judge did not announce the decision that afternoon. Instead, both sides received notice that the written ruling would be issued several days later. Those 72 hours felt longer than the previous several months combined. I returned to the ranch and went back to the routines that had always kept me grounded. Before sunrise, I fed the horses, checked the fences, and drove the southern road exactly the way my father had done for years. The gravel crunched beneath the tires with the same familiar rhythm that had echoed across this land for generations. Nothing about the ranch had changed, yet everything suddenly felt as though it was waiting for permission to breathe again. On the third morning, my attorney called just after 7 o'clock. I answered before the first ring had finished. His voice was calm, almost surprisingly calm. The court had ruled entirely in our favor. The judge concluded that recorded property rights could not be replaced by assumptions created through occasional permissive travel. The county records, the original surveys, and the recorded declaration established a clear legal history that outweighed every argument presented by the homeowners association. My family's ownership remained exactly as it had always been. I thanked him, set the phone down on the kitchen table, and stood quietly for several moments. There was no celebration, no victory speech, only the sound of the old wall clock and the distant wind moving through the cottonwood trees outside the window. That afternoon, I contacted the gate company my father had always used. By sunset, a crew arrived with a new steel locking system, fresh reflective markers, updated private property signs, and modern security cameras. Every installation followed county regulations exactly. Every notice referenced the recorded property documents confirmed by the court. Nothing was added out of frustration. Nothing was done to punish anyone. We simply restored the entrance to the way it had always been intended to operate. Early the following morning, I closed the gate, turned the key once, and listened to the solid metallic click echo across the quiet pasture. It was an ordinary sound, but after everything that had happened, it carried the weight of 3 generations. Around 8 o'clock, the first vehicles began arriving. A delivery truck stopped at the entrance before carefully reading the new signs. Minutes later, several residents from Eagle Ridge Estates pulled up behind it. One driver stepped out, looked at the chains stretched across the gate, then slowly turned back toward his vehicle. More cars arrived until a long line formed along the county road. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. Most simply looked confused. They had spent so much time believing the southern entrance belonged to everyone that they had never imagined what life would look like if the law confirmed otherwise. Throughout the day, service companies updated their routes, school transportation adjusted schedules, and navigation applications gradually redirected traffic toward the subdivision's original legal entrance several miles away. By evening, local news stations returned to film the line of vehicles waiting at the locked gate. But this time the story sounded very different. Reporters no longer spoke about a stubborn rancher refusing to cooperate. They spoke about a court decision reaffirming recorded property rights and the unexpected consequences of relying on access that had never legally belonged to the community in the first place. As I watched the sunset cast long shadows across the gravel road, I finally understood what my grandfather had meant all those years ago. He had never been protecting a strip of gravel. He had been protecting the choice of who could open the gate. The weeks that followed proved something I had learned long before this lawsuit ever began. Court decisions may end legal disputes, but they rarely end consequences. Within days, Eagle Ridge Estates held emergency board meetings that suddenly looked very different from the confident gatherings reporters had once covered. Homeowners wanted answers. They had purchased houses believing the southern road would always remain available, and now they were discovering that convenience had never been guaranteed by ownership. Delivery schedules became longer. Morning commutes changed. Service companies adjusted their maps. None of it was a crisis, but all of it reminded people that assumptions are never as dependable as recorded facts. About 2 weeks after the ruling, my attorney called to tell me that representatives from the Homeowners Association wanted to meet again. This time, there were no television cameras waiting outside, no public statements about community fairness, and no carefully rehearsed interviews. We met in the same conference room where Linda had once slid that agreement across the polished table, convinced I would eventually surrender the road. The room looked exactly the same, yet everything inside it felt different. Linda arrived carrying a much thinner folder than before. Her confident smile had been replaced by the quiet professionalism that probably should have guided the entire situation from the beginning. She acknowledged the court's decision without argument and explained that the association hoped to negotiate a voluntary commercial access agreement instead of pursuing ownership. That single difference changed everything. They were no longer asking for my property. They were asking for permission. My attorney and I reviewed every proposal carefully over the next several days. If the road were ever to be shared, it would happen under clearly defined written terms that protected the ranch exactly as my grandfather intended. Maintenance responsibilities, insurance requirements, traffic limits, future improvements, liability protections, and renewal dates were all spelled out in precise language. Most importantly, ownership would never change hands. The road would remain part of the Whitaker Ranch, just as it had been for decades. After several revisions, both sides signed an agreement that respected those boundaries. The association received a limited licensed right to use the entrance under specific conditions, while my family's property rights remained completely intact. As I drove home that evening, the setting sun painted the fields with the same golden light I had watched since I was a boy sitting beside my father in his pickup. The gate stood exactly where it always had, opening only because I chose to unlock it. I parked beside the old fence and rested one hand on the weathered post my grandfather had installed years earlier. For a long moment, I simply listened. The wind moved through the grass. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. Gravel shifted beneath a passing truck traveling with proper authorization instead of mistaken entitlement. I finally understood why my grandfather repeated those 4 simple words every time we crossed that entrance. He was never teaching me how to protect a road. He was teaching me how to protect responsibility. Land is valuable, but the principles attached to it are worth even more. If you give those away because someone demands them loudly enough, you rarely get them back. The people who celebrated outside the courthouse believed justice would come from taking something that had never belonged to them. In the end, justice arrived much more quietly than that. It arrived with old records, patient decisions, and one simple turn of a key that reminded everyone, including me, that real justice does not need to shout. It only needs the truth to remain standing long enough to be heard.